Hello, my name is Canton Little, and today I'm going to be talking about my Charles Dickens collection, how I go about reading Dickens, and the Dickens project that I'm going to be launching for myself. Stay tuned. So recently I was in my favorite bookstore in the entire world. It's on Dixon Street in Fayetteville, Arkansas. It's called the Dixon Street Bookshop. When I was going near the back in this huge labyrinthian of a bookstore, it's a massive bookstore, I ended up stumbling across this very nice edition of Charles Dickens. His works. It's about 25 volumes, and of course, if I grab one of the volumes here, you can see that some of the spine is a little worse for wear. And you might be wondering, why would you spend money on such a collection? Well, because there's some intrinsic value to collecting books of this state. And what I mean by that is that books of this state really come down to not only the age of the book, but it also comes down to the person who owned the book. So for example, when I pull out this copy of Bleak House, the first part, you can see who the owner was. And to me, the value of this book is mainly derived from the human aspect of it rather than the monetary value. This collection was released in 1911 and is part of the Dickens anniversary. Unfortunately, when I was trying to research this particular publication online, I couldn't find very many sources concerning it. So a lot of this is just me kind of having guesswork. But this is an anniversary edition published in 1911. Of course, Charles Dickens was born on February 7th, 1812. So this edition to me drives a lot of particular value because of the owner. You'll be able to see this when I do a bit of a close-up. But you'll be able to see that the spines, like for example, Pickwick Papers Volume 2, you can see that the owner really read this book quite a bit. And of course, you know, these books aren't in the best condition in terms of the covers, and I'm completely fine with that. I'm not a snob when it comes to the covers. And the reason being, I'm more concerned about the paper and the, mold, things like that within the books rather than just the outside, because these covers can always be colored in if you know how to do that, which that's more of a precarious thing. And if I really wanted to get my bang for my buck, I could just have all these rebound or have the covers recolored. It doesn't really matter. So for me, the value of this is more than just what it looks like and such. There's a piece of history here, and I really wish that I could find some publication history on this. If any of you are historians or people who just are familiar with publication history, please leave a comment down below and help me figure out how this is all gone about. Publisher for this particular set is P.F. Collier & Son, copyright 1911, and it's published in New York. Unfortunately, that's about all the information I have, other than that it's an anniversary set of Dickens. You can see the anniversary watercolor frontispiece right here. It's quite beautiful. I absolutely love Charles Dickens. Dickens is an author who has particularly struck my fancy. In high school, I never really had to read any of Dickens. I think the only thing we read was maybe The Christmas Carol. And so for me, Dickens was a bit of a, oh yeah, I've heard about him. I've read a little bit, but I wasn't too intimate with his works, and I find that to be a bit disappointing. However, I did start reading him in college, largely thanks to Benjamin McAvoy and his channel, and also because my Shakespeare professor during my undergrad was a huge Dickensian, and reading how he became a professor was quite humorous. He had finished reading A Tale of Two Cities to a high school class, and those ending lines they never fully appreciated, and so he realized he wanted to do something that was more meaningful and decided to pursue a doctorate in English, and that's how he became a Shakespeare professor. And so mainly what I'm going to be doing with Dickens is I am challenging myself to do a special authors project, if you will, reading the entirety of Dickens' oeuvre, all the published stuff. I'm not going to really try to go out for the journalistic things or anything like that, mainly because I want to focus on Dickens as a literary figure rather than just as a comprehensive figure. Part of the comprehensive figure is going to come from reading biographical information both during the time of Dickens and after, and seeing the most recent scholarship. And part of this has kind of inspired me to consider possibly pursuing a doctorate in English and writing about Dickens, and maybe including bits of Harold Bloom and things like that. And I'm not really sure what I'm thinking of right now, but I think it'd be quite an interesting paper. Before I get into how to read Dickens, I want to first just kind of show you my very nice collection. So I'm going to start off with the Old Curiosity Shop. This is volume 1 of the collection. Now I think it's very interesting that they decided to start off with the 4th book that Dickens wrote as number 1. If I were the one putting this in order, I would have done it chronologically based on publication dates, but they didn't ask me, so So as we can see, the cover is a bit worn, especially here. It doesn't look too bad right there, but you can see parts of aging and what looks to be a mildew damage and such. The paper on the inside is well preserved, very well preserved. Earlier I was actually cleaning these volumes and got a lot of dust off of it, which is nice. As you can see in the frontispiece here, you can see the original illustrations. It's such a beautiful copy, very well loved, and I'm grateful to Christine Stalter for this collection. I wish I knew more about her. Thank you, Christine, for this series. Now, the second volume, Barnaby Rudge, as you can see, the spine and the cover are relatively untouched, which tells me that Christine didn't really like Barnaby Rudge that much. Maybe she read it once or twice. And you can see this really nice frontispiece here. And the paper, again, is in very, very good condition for the age. Generally, books published in the late 19th, early 20th century, paper quality changes. There's a reason why we don't have a lot of great preservation of Victorian yellow bindings. And that's just because the paper quality is cheap, made for wide scale printing. And so we don't really have a lot of those in very great condition. Volume 3 is Sketches by Bowes. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The spine, again, is in very great condition for this type. We will go over to the little illustration here. The detail in the printing is quite impressive. And again, the paper, nothing wrong with that. Next, we have some Christmas stories. For some reason, there are 2 volumes of the Christmas stories in this particular series, and so the Christmas stories are, I guess, some of his earlier work. The Christmas stories don't include A Christmas Carol, so this just includes some of his earlier writings. Let's see if I can find that illustration. Here we see an illustration, quite nice. Up next, we have part 1 of Dombey and Son. So you can see the spine is a bit worn, not a lot of wear and tear on the book plate parts here. Again, the paper, I'm probably going to end up keep saying this, is in phenomenal condition. If I can pull out this image. We have the image here. It's such a lovely, lovely set. Of course, part 2 has a bit more wear to it than part 1, and we really get a feel of what Christine liked when she was reading or read this collection, and you'll see what I mean as I get closer to the end of this collection. You can see the beautiful illustration here. I'm sure the B-roll will show this much better than how I can. Again, the book plates are great, and the spine doesn't really have a lot of wear to it. Volume 7 and 8 is Bleak House. Bleak House has a bit more kind of a mildewy damage to it, and I'm relatively sure that Harold Bloom said that Bleak House is, in his opinion, Dickens' masterpiece. I could be wrong on that. Whenever I was having to write a research paper for my class on English Lit for my master's, Harold Bloom popped up a little bit for Bleak House, and so I would have done Bleak House, but I decided to do a paper on Hamlet, which I think that paper turned out quite well. As you can see here, Bleak House, it's just such a well-kept set, and I'm very pleased. Now, when we get to volumes 9 and 10, Pickwick Papers, we start to see a bit more wear and tear, so to speak, on the spine and book plates. And I take it that Christine very much enjoyed the Pickwick Papers. I'm not sure the condition or, the housing conditions that these books were housed in, but I can assure you, dear viewer, that these books will definitely be taken care of in my residence. You can see here that the spine certainly has a bit more wear and tear than the book plates, and again, the art in the front is quite telling of the story. I'm still working my way through the Pickwick Papers, so I'm not sure exactly who or what is being illustrated in the frontispiece, but I'm sure I will find out as I trudge along. And volumes 11 and 12 are Martin Chuzzlewit, which was one of Dickens' worst performing books, which led to him having to actually self-publish The Christmas Carol. He had to kind of publish on his own dime because his publishers, Chapman and Hall, weren't impressed with his book sales for Martin Chuzzlewit. And we can see the titular character right there. Again, it's a very well kept tome. And here's volume 12, Part 2, Martin Chuzzlewit. I was very happy to come across this. I was really hoping that I would. And I love supporting my local bookstores, and I encourage you, dear viewer, to peruse your local bookstores, because local bookstores often have little tidbits of history that we would take for granted just going to a big name bookstore. And don't get me wrong, I love Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Waterstones, Hatchards, you name it, I love it. I love big bookstores, but I also like the mom and pop shop. After all, some of the most important books I've ever gotten in my life have been secondhand. And volume 13 is A Tale of Two Cities. A Tale of Two Cities is such a fantastic book. I really need to do a separate video on it. It is definitely Dickens' best story in terms of just plots from what I've read. It has the most iconic opening line, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and the ending line, I just discovered that Edwin Drood is also in this. How quaint. Okay, that makes me feel a bit better, because I was wondering where Edwin Drood was. But yeah, Edwin Drood is in this tome. So moving on to volume 14 and 15 is Our Mutual Friend, which this was the second to last thing Dickens wrote. As you can see, the book is in very great condition. Here's the artwork. I'm kind of just ad-libbing a lot of this because there's not a lot of research I could find on this particular set, but also I haven't read most of these books, so for me, I'm just kind of talking about how I'm going to go approaching these books. And so we have volume 15, which is Our Mutual Friend Part 2. And so I guess while I'm talking about my Dickens collection, I should go ahead and just talk about how I'm going to approach Dickens. So the way that I generally approach Dickens is through what we call just immersive reading, and it's pretty much me throwing off the critical lens and deeply reading into it, and I just read it for the fun the first time around. Now, generally when I generally read with my critical lens on, and I'm trying to understand some deeper aspects of a book, which may not be the most effective way to read, but I find that it's just the way that I read, and part of that comes from my training with philosophy. So when I approach Dickens, I have to sort of abandon that motif of analyzing, and just enjoy the story, and then return back to it and then analyze it. Of course, when I see great prose, I underline it as soon as I can. So now that we approach volume 16, we get to the Christmas books, which just has the Christmas Carol. And so this particular volume is quite special to me, and that's because you can see that in the opening bits, and that the pages are loose. And you might be wondering, well, why would you pay for a book that has loose pages? Well, that tells me that Christine probably read this book to her children and her grandchildren every Christmas, and I have the same tradition of reading the Christmas Carol every Christmas, and I want to make that a family tradition. And so this particularly strikes home to me because it shows you that the soul of the reader who owned this is still present within this particular volume, and that just really touches me. Almost to an emotional point. You can really see how much love was put into this particular volume, and so to me this is just so special. And I really hope that you, dear viewer, come across a volume, something like this, where there's just a lot of emotional resonance, where you can see the soul, part of the soul, and I guess in a Proustian sense, that remains within the volume of someone who's owned a book. So we get on to volume 17, and now we have arguably the most famous of Dickens' works, Great Expectations. And this is a particular volume that I am very much looking forward to reading, and I think that reading Dickens also requires a bit of an entrance novel. And I know that Benjamin McAvoy and other YouTubers generally go into more depth on this, but my entrance novel to Dickens was A Tale of Two Cities. Before that, I really just read A Christmas Carol, and that's not really a novel. You could say it's maybe a short story or a novella if you're really pushing it. But A Tale of Two Cities resonated with me on an emotional level, and I know that Dickens is quite an emotionally engaging writer. His observation of sociological events, commentaries on society, and the way that he describes people often strikes me as humorous, insightful, and in some ways I can see how Tolstoy was influenced by Dickens. So having an entrance novel was quite important to Dickens. I would say really to any author in general. Like if I was going to recommend you getting into Dostoevsky, I recommend starting off with either Notes from Underground or Crime and Punishment, because then you start to under the motifs, the style, the prose of Dostoevsky. But also when reading literature and translation, it's important to find a translator who resonates with you. So the bit of a funny thing is, whenever I was trying to get into Don Quixote, I was reading the Moteau translation, which is a translation that is universally regarded as the worst translation. I have the Grossman translation, so I'll be reading a critically acclaimed translation, but I have the Mateau translation. So it's important to find a good translation because translators have different philosophies, and those different philosophies can influence both the style, the syntax, and the overall voice of the author, and it can change it for better or for worse. Now, volumes 18 and 19 are Nicholas Nickleby, and Nicholas Nickleby is quite an endearing bit of Dickens. Not his most well-regarded work from what I've seen critically. However, it certainly is a staple in his oeuvre. And then volume 20 and 21 are David Copperfield. We have David Copperfield, which looks like it wasn't read that much, which is unfortunate because David Copperfield is also widely regarded as his best work, or one of his best work. And then we have volume 2 right here, and the frontispiece. And the last few books are Child's History of England, which is volume 22. And then we also have Little Dorrit and Oliver Twist. Here we just have an illustration of Dickens. This is such a very nice illustration. Volume 21 and 22 is Little Dorrit, or sorry, 23 and 24 is Little Dorrit. And so we have an image here, and you can see that Part 2, Little Dorrit, has a little bit of wear and tear on the spine, not so much on the book plates. What looks to be very, very well read over here. There. And last but not least, we have arguably what I think most people read when they approach Dickens for the first time, which is Oliver Twist. Now, Oliver Twist, this particular volume, it's pretty well worn all over, which tells me that Christine must have enjoyed reading Oliver Twist. Perhaps it was her favorite of Dickens novels. Please, sir, can I have some more? The dog looks absolutely terrified. And so that is my 1911 anniversary edition of Dickens. And so I mentioned two ways about how to get into Dickens, and really my big approach and what I'm hoping to do with reading Dickens, and what I'm hoping to really inspire you to do, is to approach Dickens from an emotional perspective, if that makes sense. His work is not really meant to be heavily dissected upon initial reading. It's more of you get into the thrill of the journey, thrill of the story. You get to resonate with the characters on an emotional level. And that's what makes reading Dickens so important, because Dickens does have a lot of important things to say philosophically or contemporaneously about society at that time. And having an understanding of Victorian society does help when reading Dickens, or really reading any of the Victorians like George Eliot or Thomas Hardy. However, it's not absolutely necessary, because you can fill in the details with reading Dickens, how society was set up at that time. For me, Charles Dickens remains the most timeless of the Victorians, and it's why he's pretty much dubbed the Victorian novelist. He is an enduring figure, and I think he's more important than ever when reading about the issues of today, because poverty today is still an issue, but it's nowhere near the level of issue that it was during the time of the Victorian age. Class inequality is still a prevalent issue, but nowhere near as prevalent as it was during the Victorian age. And so there's something insightful we can learn about reading Dickens from a contemporary perspective, but also understanding the historicity of his work. Dickens, like many other authors who are part of the Western canon, if you subscribe to that idea, they're timeless and they're enduring, and what separates them from the regular ilk, so to speak, is that they have that timeless quality. They always have a message that resonates with the human soul, with our heart, with our mind, resonates on various different levels. And so approaching Dickens from an analytical view minimizes the emotional resonance. As I always recommend having a journal or having some sort of way to take notes. Marginalia is always important. Of course, you wouldn't catch me writing anywhere in these books at all. So I have the Oxfords for the good paperbacks, trusty paperbacks that I can get all dirty and muddy, put part of my soul into. But we don't do that to the nice books. And of course, you have my leather-bound collection here. And so I find that having some sort of roadmap to read Dickens is always important. If you'd like me to, I might make a series on reading Dickens, starting off with the Pickwick Papers. I think that might be a good way of just kind of going about it. One thing I'd like to recommend you is to read within a group. You can do it with a book club. You can do it with maybe a couple friends, your parents. Quite notably, my parents and I, we are members of Ben McAvoy's book club, and so we are always reading alongside Ben. And Ben always has great material. I'm not going to sit here and just say that I wasn't inspired by his Dickens video, because I am. And of course, I have a completely different message and view and things like that compared to what he does. And that's what makes BookTube so exciting, is this discourse and somewhat of this shameless plug, because Ben is a very big inspiration of mine. And I one day like to run a book club on a similar level to his, not exactly the same because I have different approaches to how I read literature compared to him, but I very much appreciate and acknowledge the sort of literary renaissance that he has given us. So if you'd like me to maybe start a book club or anything like that, just let me know in the comments below. Arguably one of the most notable Dickensian scholars, not really contemporary Dickens, is G.K. Chesterton. He wrote various things on Charles Dickens, and so it's always interesting to see how other readers approach Dickens at that time. So my last tip for reading Dickens is if you can find the voices of people or the writings of people who they thought what they said over any particular book, then you can always, agree, disagree, and it gives you a special insight into how magnificent and how earth-breaking Dickens was at the height of his popularity. And truly, Dickens has never become unpopular. If I'm not mistaken, I don't think any of his books have gone out of print since they were published. So that tells me that he has a very enduring legacy. So I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did. This is probably going to be the longest video I upload in a long time. This was fun. And I hope you enjoyed looking at this very unique set of Dickens. Of course, there are other sets of Dickens. I know that there's this India paper set of Dickens from 1907 I'd love to get my hands on, and of course Moon's Rare Books has this really nice burgundy set of Dickens work from I think 1906, 1907 as well. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got some insight on Dickens, some insight on book collecting, and ultimately some insight on how I approach literature and how maybe you should approach literature. If you like this video, please subscribe, please share it, please leave a comment on whether or not you'd like me to maybe consider starting up a book club if there's enough interest. Of course, if you want to get more in-depth stuff on Dickens, there's YouTubers that I'll link in the description below. Shameless shout out to Ben again. Thank you guys so very much for watching, and I will see you again very, very soon. Bye-bye.